He saw her slip the money into her apron. And in Grant Whitmore's world, that was enough to end a career. The billionaire stood motionless in the dim hallway, crystal glass warming in his hand as Naomi Ellison turned away from the kitchen, folded bills hidden against her uniform. She moved fast, too fast for someone with nothing to hide. Grant didn't call security, didn't speak. He just watched her disappear through the back door into the freezing night, something cold and familiar tightening in his chest. Staff didn't leave after hours. Not with cash. Not like that. Outside, the wind cut hard across the estate as he set the glass down and reached for his coat. If she was stealing, he would know before sunrise. And if she wasn't, then whatever she was risking had to matter more than everything he could take from her. Naomi Ellison had only worked at Whitmore Estate for 12 days. But in a house that polished every surface to a mirror shine, she had already learned how to make herself invisible. She arrived before sunrise, when the marble floors still held the night's cold and the chandeliers above the main foyer glowed low like sleeping stars. By the time the first espresso machine hissed to life in the kitchen, she'd already folded fresh linens, wiped fingerprints from the West Wing glass, and carried enough silence in her body to fill every empty hallway in the mansion. That was the first thing people noticed about her, not what she said, but what she didn't. Naomi never lingered, never asked questions, never joined the gossip that floated around the staff laundry room in tired whispers. She moved with the quiet precision of someone who had learned a long time ago that drawing attention was expensive. But there were small things that didn't fit. She always left exactly on time, no matter how much work was left. She kept an old cracked phone tucked deep in her apron pocket and checked it only when she thought no one was looking. And once, 2 days earlier, Grant had passed the service stairwell and seen her standing alone beneath the fluorescent light, eyes shut, forehead pressed to the wall like she was holding herself together by force. By the time he stepped closer, she had already straightened up and gone back to work. She never explained. He never asked. In another house, Naomi might have been dismissed as private. In Grant Whitmore's world, privacy felt too close to concealment. Still, there was nothing sloppy about her. She worked harder than half the full-time staff and cleaner than anyone he'd hired in years. The silver in the dining room had never gleamed brighter. The library shelves, usually dusted in haste, looked untouched by human hands. Even Mrs. Calloway, the estate manager who trusted no one under 50, had grudgingly admitted Naomi was efficient. But efficiency wasn't what stayed with Grant. It was the way she carried herself, like someone permanently braced for impact. She was too young to look that tired, too composed to be careless, and too guarded for a woman making minimum wage in someone else's mansion. He'd caught her once giving half her untouched lunch to the groundskeeper's grandson near the service gate. Another time, she'd stitched a loose hem on one of the cook's uniforms without being asked. She never took credit, never lingered for thanks. She just did the thing and disappeared. That should have made her easier to trust. Somehow, it did the opposite. Because Grant Whitmore had spent too many years around polished lies to believe in quiet goodness at face value. And now, standing in the cold with his collar turned against the wind as he watched Naomi vanish deeper into a neighborhood no one from his world ever entered by choice, he realized the distance between who she appeared to be and whatever she was hiding might be far greater than he'd imagined. Grant Whitmore had built a life around control so complete it no longer felt like discipline. It felt like oxygen. At 42, he owned hotels, logistics chains, half a dozen private equity holdings, and the kind of generational wealth that made people lower their voices when he entered a room. His name sat on hospital wings, museum plaques, and campaign donor lists. Men twice his age waited for him to return calls. Women in silk smiled too quickly when he looked their way. And still, every night he came home to a house so quiet it felt embalmed. Whitmore Estate was less a home than a polished fortress of old money and newer paranoia. Black iron gates, limestone walls, motion sensors tucked into every blind corner, cameras hidden behind carved molding and imported sconces. The place was beautiful in the way expensive things often were. Cold, exact, and impossible to relax inside. Even the air seemed filtered of spontaneity. Nothing happened there by accident. Not after what had happened 3 years ago. Grant never said her name anymore. Not his ex-wife's, not his brother's, Not the CFO who had smiled over bourbon while draining 7 figures through shell accounts. Betrayal had taught him efficiency. Since then, he trusted systems, contracts, surveillance, and patterns. He trusted timing. He trusted numbers. He did not trust people who moved quietly through rooms and left no fingerprints. That was why Naomi bothered him more than she should have. She didn't flirt for favor, didn't perform gratitude, didn't steal glances at the artwork or linger near wealth like it might rub off on her. She just worked and left. That should have made her forgettable. Instead, it made her impossible to place. He had watched seasoned assistants try to charm him, consultants try to impress him, investors try to read him. Naomi did none of it. When he spoke, she answered respectfully but without that thin edge of fear he was used to hearing from staff. When Mrs. Calloway corrected her, she nodded once and adjusted without defensiveness. She never over-explained, never apologized too much. She carried herself like someone who had already survived worse than this house. That unsettled him, because in Grant's experience, the people who asked for nothing were usually the ones hiding the most. And now, as he stood half-shadowed beneath a broken street lamp 3 miles from his estate, expensive leather shoes damp with city grime, watching the same woman hurry down a cracked sidewalk with stolen money pressed against her ribs, something in him sharpened. This was familiar terrain after all. Not the neighborhood, not the cold, not the smell of wet brick and old fryer oil in the air, but the feeling, the tightening in his chest, the instinct that said, there it is, the lie, the reveal, the proof that no one stays clean for long. Naomi turned the corner without looking back, and Grant followed at a distance, jaw set, pulse low, certain he was about to catch her becoming exactly who he suspected she was. He had no idea that within minutes, the power in this story was about to shift, and not in his favor. Naomi didn't slow down until she reached the bus stop at the edge of the district, her breath visible in short, controlled bursts as she stepped under the flickering shelter light. She didn't look back this time. Not once. That alone told Grant she believed she was safe. He stayed across the street, half-shadowed behind a closed storefront, watching as she pulled the folded bills from her apron and counted them quickly with stiff fingers, her movements precise but urgent. Then she slipped the money into her bag and boarded the bus without hesitation. Grant followed in his car, keeping distance, headlights low, tracking the route as it cut away from the city's polished center into something quieter, darker, and far less forgiving. 3 stops later, Naomi got off near a strip of boarded shops and a pharmacy still glowing faintly under a buzzing neon sign. She moved fast again, pushing through the glass door as a bell chimed weakly overhead. Grant parked across the street, engine running, watching through the window as she approached the counter and spoke to the pharmacist with a calm intensity that didn't match the hour. He saw her hand over the cash, saw the man hesitate, then disappear into the back. Seconds stretched. Naomi stood still, shoulders tight, eyes fixed forward like she was willing the moment not to collapse. When the pharmacist returned, he placed a small paper bag on the counter. Naomi exhaled, just once, relief breaking through her control for a fraction of a second before she grabbed the bag and turned away. Grant stepped out of the car now, crossing the street slower, keeping enough distance to avoid being seen. This was no longer about suspicion. It was about understanding what kind of risk she thought was worth taking his money for. Naomi didn't head back toward any main road. Instead, she cut through a narrow alley behind the pharmacy, shoes scraping against wet concrete, disappearing between 2 crumbling buildings where the streetlights didn't reach. Grant followed on foot, the cold biting harder now, the city quieter, the space between them tightening. This was the moment she crossed the line. Not just from his world into hers, but into something he had no control over. At the end of the alley, she stopped at a rusted metal door attached to what looked like an abandoned storage unit. No signage, no light, no reason for anyone to be there. She knocked twice, soft but deliberate. A pause. Then the door creaked open just enough for her to slip inside. Grant reached the edge seconds later, staring at the door, jaw tightening. This was it. Whatever she had taken, whatever she was hiding, was behind that wall. And if he walked through that door, There was no pretending he didn't want the truth. He hesitated only a second, then pushed it open and stepped inside, fully aware that whatever he was about to see could cost Naomi her job, or prove that everything he believed about her had been wrong from the start. The smell hit Grant before anything else. Bleach, damp concrete, stale food, and something sharper underneath it all. Illness. He stopped just inside the door, one hand still on the metal frame, the cold outside replaced by something heavier, harder to breathe through. This wasn't a place people chose. It was where they ended up when every other door had closed. Naomi was already on the floor, not standing, not explaining, kneeling in front of a child whose small body shook with each strained breath, a frayed blanket slipping from his shoulders as panic tightened his chest. She didn't see Grant, or if she did, he no longer mattered. "Look at me. Not the cough, look at me," she said softly, one hand steady against the boy's back, the other lifting an inhaler to his mouth with practiced care. No hesitation, no fear, just focus. The grandmother beside him was trembling. Her fingers gripping Naomi's sleeve like it was the only thing holding the night together. "I didn't think you'd make it back," she whispered. Naomi didn't look up. He couldn't wait till morning. The words landed heavier than anything Grant had heard all night. Couldn't wait. Not later. Not safer. Not when it was convenient. Now, Grant felt something shift under his ribs, sharp, unwelcome. Because one word from him, one accusation, one call, one order, and this woman would lose everything. Her job, her access, whatever fragile system she had built to keep this place alive. And she had known that, known it and still taken the money. Not for herself. Never for herself. Naomi reached into her bag, pulling out medicine, food, small supplies, placing each item into someone else's hands without pause, without calculation. A man in the corner sat up when he saw her. A woman near the heater exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for hours. No one asked where the money came from. They didn't need to. It wasn't a transaction here. It was survival. The boy's coughing worsened suddenly, deep, breaking, desperate, and Naomi moved closer, grounding him with her voice, counting softly as he struggled through each breath. Grant took a step forward before he realized it, then stopped himself. Because the truth wasn't unfolding slowly. It was collapsing all at once. Every assumption he had made, every certainty. He hadn't followed a thief into the dark. He had followed the only person in his house willing to spend everything she had to keep someone else from disappearing overnight. The grandmother's voice cracked. "You used your own again, didn't you?" Naomi shook her head, but the silence after said enough. "It's fine." It wasn't fine. Grant could see that now, in the thinness of her sweater, the tremor she refused to acknowledge, the way she never once reached for anything meant for herself. This wasn't generosity. It was cost. Real cost. The kind his world avoided, outsourced, disguised behind donations and speeches. Naomi reached up, untied the scarf from her own neck, and wrapped it around the boy without a second thought, sealing warmth where there was none. The child leaned into her instantly, trust without question. And that, more than anything, broke something in Grant. Because there was no audience here, no leverage, no reward, just cold illness and a woman who had chosen to carry it anyway. He had come looking for proof she didn't belong in his world. Instead, he found proof that he didn't belong in hers. Grant didn't move. He stayed half in shadow near the door, the cold metal pressing faintly against his palm, while the room settled into a quieter rhythm around Naomi. The boy's coughing had eased to small, tired breaths now, each one softer than the last. Somewhere in the corner, the old space heater clicked and rattled like it was trying not to give up. Naomi sat cross-legged on the concrete floor in front of the child, one knee drawn up, her posture sagging for the first time all night now that the worst had passed. She looked smaller here than she ever did at Whitmore Estate. Not weaker, just more real. The overhead bulb above her flickered once, then held, casting a pale yellow wash over the side of her face and catching the exhaustion beneath her eyes. She didn't know she was being watched. Or if she did, She chose not to break the moment by acknowledging it. Instead, she reached for the paper cup on the floor, tested the water with her finger, then held it carefully for the grandmother to sip. Her hands were steady, but the skin across her knuckles looked dry and cracked from too much soap, too much winter, too much work that no one ever thanked her for properly. The grandmother whispered something too low for Grant to hear. Naomi answered with the smallest nod, then adjusted the scarf around the boy's shoulders again, tucking it in close beneath his chin, the way someone does when they've learned comfort through repetition. No performance, no rush, just patience. Across the room, the woman by the heater had fallen asleep sitting upright, her cheek against the wall. A plastic grocery bag near her feet held 2 oranges, a loaf of bread, and a bottle of cough syrup. Someone had folded a child's drawing and taped it to one of the support beams. A crooked house, a yellow sun, for stick figures holding hands. It was the kind of detail Grant would never have noticed before. Tonight it landed like a bruise. Naomi exhaled slowly and rubbed her hands together for warmth, but she didn't put her coat back on. She had already laid it over the old man sleeping nearest the draft. Grant saw that now, saw the thin sweater beneath her uniform, the slight tremor in her shoulders she was too disciplined to acknowledge. She was cold, tired, probably underpaid, and still she was here, still giving away warmth she did not have to spare. A few minutes passed in near silence, the kind that doesn't feel empty, only sacred. Naomi looked down at the little boy after his breathing finally steadied and let one hand rest lightly against his forehead. Her expression changed then. Not dramatically, not enough for anyone else in the room to notice, but enough for Grant to see it. Something old moved through her face. Grief, maybe. Memory. The kind that arrives quietly and sits beside you without asking permission. She blinked once, hard, then lowered her eyes and swallowed it back like she'd done it 1,000 times before. That hit him harder than the medicine, harder than the scarf, harder than the shame. Because now he understood this wasn't charity to her. It was personal. It had roots. And whatever pain had taught Naomi Ellison how to do this so gently, it had never really left her. The city outside groaned with distant traffic and winter wind, but inside that room, everything narrowed to breath, fabric, dim light, and the unbearable softness of a woman who had every reason to become hard, and somehow hadn't. Grant stood there with his expensive coat still buttoned, his watch glinting faintly beneath the weak bulb, and for the first time in years, all his money felt uselessly loud. Grant should have left. He should have turned around, gone back to the car, and buried what he'd seen beneath the same polished silence he used for everything else he didn't know how to carry. Instead, he stayed, long enough to hear the truth arrive without anyone realizing he was there to receive it. The little boy had fallen asleep against his grandmother's side, the scarf still tucked under his chin, his breathing finally deep and even. Naomi sat back on her heels and reached for the empty medicine box to fold it flat. Even trash had to be made smaller when there wasn't room for waste. The grandmother watched her with eyes full of a gratitude too tired to perform. "Your mama would be proud of you," she said softly. Naomi's hands stopped, just for a second. Then she resumed folding the cardboard. "She wouldn't be proud of me taking money that isn't mine," Naomi said, voice low, steady, but thinner now. Grant's spine stiffened at the door. The grandmother frowned. "That rich man's tip money?" Naomi nodded once. "He left it on the kitchen tray after dinner again. Said anybody could take it if they wanted. No one ever does." She let out a breath that sounded more like fatigue than relief. "I told myself I'd put it back on Friday after payroll if the clinic covered Malik's refill tomorrow. But he started wheezing tonight and I couldn't wait." Grant felt something cold move through his chest. The money hadn't been stolen. Not really. He remembered the moment now with humiliating clarity. Him waving off the bills after a private dinner. Distracted, irritated, telling the house staff to clear the tray and take whatever's left. He hadn't even looked at Naomi when he said it. To him, it had been nothing. To her, it had become medicine. "You keep saying you'll pay things back," the grandmother whispered. "But baby, you barely got enough for yourself." Naomi gave a small, tired smile and tucked the flattened box into her bag. "I've had enough before," she said. "I know what not enough looks like." The room went still in a different way then. Not silence, memory. The old woman lowered her voice. "You still think about that winter?" Naomi didn't answer right away. She stared at the boy's sleeping face, then reached up and smoothed the blanket over his shoulder. When she finally spoke, her voice carried no self-pity at all, and that made it harder to hear. "My mother died waiting for help from people who kept saying they'd come back in the morning." Grant's hand tightened around the edge of the door so hard his knuckles blanched. Naomi kept going, not because she wanted to tell the story, but because some truths come out only when they've been living in the body too long. "We were in a shelter outside Durham. Heat kept going out. She had pneumonia, but she kept telling me she was fine because she didn't want me scared. I was 13. Her mouth pressed thin for a second, then steadied. By the time someone finally came with antibiotics, it was too late. The grandmother closed her eyes. Naomi looked down at her own hands. "So when people say they'll wait till tomorrow, I don't hear patience. I hear a clock." Grant stopped breathing evenly. Every suspicion he had carried into that room now looked grotesque in hindsight. Not just wrong, but small. He had followed her through the city believing he was about to expose deception, when the truth was far worse for him than dishonesty ever could have been. Naomi wasn't hiding greed. She was hiding grief. Purpose. A private war against the exact kind of neglect that men like him donated around without ever touching. She reached into her bag again and pulled out a folded receipt, checking the total under the weak overhead light. "If the church pantry gets their shipment tomorrow, I can skip groceries till Monday," she murmured, more to herself than anyone else. "And if Mrs. Calloway doesn't notice the extra linens missing from laundry, I can bring blankets back Friday night." Grant shut his eyes. There it was, the full reversal, brutal in its simplicity. She had been taking from abundance to protect the abandoned. Not for herself. Not for image. Not because anyone would ever know. Because she had once been the child in the cold, and she had made some private vow over a dying woman's body that no one under her watch would be left waiting if she could help it. He opened his eyes again and looked at Naomi differently now. Not as an employee, not as a suspect, not even as a woman doing something admirable. He looked at her as the strongest person in the room. Stronger than him. Stronger than the polished version of morality he had built with tax receipts and gala speeches and his last name engraved on stone. Naomi had no foundation in her name, no PR team, no public generosity to cushion her conscience. Just a thin sweater, cracked hands, a dead mother, and a refusal to let someone else disappear. The way hers had. The power shifted so completely in that moment it almost made him dizzy. Grant Whitmore had followed Naomi Ellison into the dark, believing he was the one with authority. But standing there now, unseen in the doorway while she quietly held together lives the world had already priced as disposable, he realized he had never felt smaller in his life. Grant didn't wait until morning. He didn't rehearse a speech, didn't run numbers, didn't route the decision through lawyers or advisors the way he did with everything else in his life. He stood in that doorway a few seconds longer, then stepped fully into the room, the sound of his shoes against the concrete enough to shift every head at once. Naomi turned first. The moment her eyes met his, something tightened across her face. Not fear, not guilt, but recognition of consequence. She already understood what this could cost her. Grant saw it immediately, saw the way her posture straightened, the way her hands instinctively moved away from the supplies like she was ready to take the blame before he even spoke. The room went still again, but this time it wasn't quiet. It was waiting. "Mr. Whitmore?" she said, barely above a breath. No excuse, no explanation, just acknowledgement. Grant felt the weight of that more than anything she could have said. He took another step forward, then stopped, suddenly aware that every instinct he had built over the years, to control, to correct, to dominate the situation, felt wrong here. Useless. He glanced around the room once, not as an outsider now, but as someone being measured. Then he reached into his coat, pulled out his wallet, and for a split second, It looked exactly like the version of him Naomi had already rejected in her life, the man who thought money solved everything. He saw it too, paused, then slowly lowered his hand. "I was wrong," he said instead. The words landed heavier than any accusation ever could have. Naomi didn't move. She didn't thank him. She didn't soften. She just held his gaze, waiting to see if he understood what he was saying. Grant swallowed once, the cold air catching in his throat. "I thought you were taking from me," he continued, quieter now. "I didn't think," he stopped, because the truth was worse than the sentence. He hadn't thought at all. Naomi's eyes flickered, just slightly. Not forgiveness. Not yet. Just acknowledgement that he had finally reached the right place. "You followed me," she said. It wasn't a question. Grant nodded once. No defense. No justification. Yes. The room tightened again, but not against Naomi, against him. The man in the corner shifted. The grandmother pulled the blanket a little closer around the boy. Grant felt it. The distance. The judgment. For the first time, he wasn't the one deciding how this room would feel. He took a breath and did something far more difficult than writing a check. He removed his coat. Slowly. Deliberately. Then he crossed the room and knelt. Actually knelt. Beside the old man sleeping near the draft and draped the coat over him without a word. The movement was awkward, unfamiliar, almost clumsy, but it was real. No announcement. No eye contact. Just action. When he stood again, he didn't look at Naomi right away. He walked to the space heater, crouched, and adjusted the loose connection in the cord until the rattle softened and the weak heat steadied just a little more. Then he moved to the table, picked up the empty water container, and headed toward the sink in the back as if he had always belonged to this kind of work. Only then did he look back at her. Naomi was still watching him, but something in her expression had shifted. Not trust, not yet, but the absence of dismissal. He didn't reach for his wallet again. Didn't offer numbers, donations, or promises that would let him leave clean. Instead, he said the only thing that mattered now. "Tell me what needs to be done." It wasn't a command. It wasn't even confident. It was an offering, uncertain, late, but honest. Naomi held his gaze for a long second, measuring the difference between guilt and change. Then she nodded once, small but real, and gestured toward the stack of folded blankets near the wall. "Start with those," she said quietly. Grant moved without hesitation. And for the first time in years, he wasn't performing generosity. He was learning it. Morning came quietly, like the night hadn't made a sound worth remembering, but the room still carried traces of it. Folded blankets stacked a little neater, empty cups rinsed and lined along the sink, the space heater humming with less resistance than before. Naomi stood near the doorway, her hands wrapped around a chipped mug, watching as Grant Whitmore adjusted the corner of a mattress on the floor without being asked. He moved slower now, not from uncertainty but from attention, the kind that came from noticing things for the first time. No one announced what had changed. No one needed to. The boy was still asleep, his breathing steady beneath the scarf she had given him. The grandmother dozed beside him, one hand resting lightly against his shoulder as if she trusted the quiet to hold. Grant stepped back once he finished, glancing at the room not like an owner, but like someone making sure nothing had been missed. His coat was still draped over the old man by the draft. He hadn't taken it back. Naomi set her mug down and walked past him, pausing only long enough to press a folded piece of cloth into his hands. Another blanket, worn but clean. He took it without speaking. Their eyes met briefly. No apology this time. No explanation. Just recognition. Then she turned away, kneeling beside the boy again, tucking the edge of the scarf closer beneath his chin. Outside, the first light of morning slipped through the cracked window, soft and pale, settling over the room without asking permission. Grant stood there for a moment longer, the blanket still in his hands, then moved to where it was needed. No one watched him. No one praised him. And for the first time in his life, that was enough.